interesting papers. The first one will be presented by Laureen, bidding strategy of a seasonal storage hydropower plant in reserve markets. Laureen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laureen Deman. I am a PhD student at SuperGrid Institute and Guérard Laboratory. The model and the results I'm going to present you has been built for the X-Flex Hydro project, which is financed by the European Union. So this paper analyzes the bidding strategies of two different storage hydropower plants in reserve markets. With the decarbonization of the power mix, we can expect two consequences in terms of frequency control reserves. The first one is an increase of demand because of the intermittency of renewable energy sources. And on the other hand, we can expect a decrease of the supply from gas and coal-fired plants in order to reduce CO2 emissions. In Western continental Europe, the procurement of reserves is mainly market-based. So relevant price signals are needed in order to incentivize the participation of low carbon and flexible technologies in reserve market in order to meet demand. So the objective of this paper is to analyze this issue for the particular case of hydropower plants in the specific context of France. The methodology we applied is a deterministic model, which tells us the bidding volumes in energy and reserve markets that maximize the revenues of our power plants. We consider the 4 reserves existing in France, and we also distinguish between reserve capacity and reserve energy. I will define these different markets just after. And we obtained a large participation in reserve markets for 2 case studies, but we also observed for the pump storage plant a higher probability to choose the FCR market, and also greater responsiveness to incentive measures we applied. In terms of literature, the methodology we have chosen is inscribed into 3 different types of literature. The first one is about the type of model to choose between a stochastic and a deterministic model. The 2 papers cited in the slide have obtained the same bidding decisions with both approaches. So we have chosen a deterministic model because bidding decisions are what we are looking for. The other question is how to represent the reserve markets. And in the literature, it has been shown that with a deterministic model, we can apply a one-stage model as if all markets clear at the same time. And the last topic deals with the long-term management of the water reservoir. 2 different approach has been studied in the literature, and we have chosen the one consisting in setting a reservoir level to attain at the end of the optimization period. And this way, this reservoir level represents the opportunity of profit after the end of our optimization period. In continental Europe, we have 4 types of reserves, which are listed below. Their differences remain in the activation time, ranging from 30 seconds to more than 15 minutes. The spinning or non-spinning nature, which is the necessity to be online to supply the service or not, and also the type of activation between a pro rata-based and a merit order-based activation. So in our model, we have represented these 4 reserves with their respective characteristics. And we also distinguish between reserve capacity and reserve energy. The first one corresponds to the availability of reserves, whereas reserve energy corresponds to the actual level of reserve activated in real time. So if we supply reserve capacity, we do not automatically supply reserve energy in real time, depending on the need of the transmission system operator. For our model, we assume that the unit doesn't influence market prices and that it knows all prices in advance. And we also assume that it's not possible to supply upward and downward reserves at the same time. So we only focus in physical deliveries. The objective is to maximize revenues in energy and reserve market, with the energy market being the day-ahead market only. And the decision variables is the volume sold in each market. We have also deduced startup costs from the objective function because in the literature it has been shown that they influence the bidding decisions. We applied this model to two case studies, a seasonal storage and a pumped storage hydropower plant. In order to draw relevant comparisons, we applied the same generation and reservoir capacity and also the same level of inflows. And we applied it with 2019 French prices. So here is a representation of the distribution of hourly revenues for two case studies that we obtained. The seasonal storage plant only generates 8% of the year, which is consistent with the water available and also its generation capacity. By contrast, the pumped storage plant generates more often because it can use several times the same amount of water. And in the distribution of revenues, we can see that the majority of these additional hours happens when revenues are relatively lower. And this observation has implications in terms of bidding strategies that I will present just now. So the graph represents the different bidding strategies that we obtained. The two first strategies are the only one chosen by the seasonal storage plant. So the first one consists in bidding the maximal power in upward reserve energy market. And the second one consists in bidding the maximal power in the day-ahead market and to supply downward reserve energy as well. So it means that for this power plant, it is always profitable to participate in reserve market. The two other strategies are only chosen by the pumped storage plants, and I will focus on the last one, which involves the FCR market, which is the fastest reserve that exists in France. This strategy is rarely chosen by the power plant. However, its introduction is interesting because, as I said before, the pumped storage power plant has a higher generation frequency. So it means that it chooses some hours with lower revenues. And in the price data, we can see that reserve energy and FCR revenues are closer when reserve energy revenues are relatively lower. It means that during these hours of lower revenues, the probability to choose the FCR market is higher. So the participation in the FCR market is inexistent for the seasonal storage plant and really low for the pumped storage plant. So we applied some incentive measures to see if it's possible to incentivize our power plants to go in this market. So we applied two different incentive measures. The first one is a price premium. And the second one is a reduction of the contract duration, because it is currently of 4 hours, and it may reduce the participation in this market. So in the graph, you can see the results in terms of number of hours this market is chosen by our 2 power plants. So the 2 incentive measures are inefficient for the seasonal storage power plant, but the effect is more significant for the seasonal storage plant, even if this strategy remains marginal compared to the others. But this difference in results is explained again by the difference in generation frequency. During hours with lower revenues, it was more likely to choose the FCR market, and so our incentive measures are more efficient because it is more likely to modify the trade-off between reserve energy and FCR markets. So to conclude, we have studied 2 hydropower plants with the same ramping capabilities, but we obtained different contributions to each reserve market and also different responses to incentive measures. This result suggests that in addition to the ramping capability, the generation frequency is also a parameter in the choice of building strategy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Laureen. We have space for questions from our audience. Christoph?
Yes, so thank you for the interesting talk. I was wondering if you could tell a little bit more about your model. So how does the pump storage unit decide which market it wants to go into? Is it like an optimization model? This kind of stuff.
Yes, so it's an optimization model. So the decision to go in one market or another is made according to market prices mainly. Startup costs also influence the decision, but the impact is quite limited. And so, yes, the decision criteria is the revenue we obtain per megawatt hour produced. And it's the main idea behind the model.
Okay, so for the reserve markets, you also know all the prices with perfect foresight?
Yes, with perfect foresight.
Okay, because I guess that this would be a rather reasonable assumption for maybe the day-ahead market, but for the reserve market, I think it's a quite strong assumption. So maybe you would want to look into that again and think about whether you can relax the perfect foresight component there.
Yeah, it's definitely a strong assumption. And we are thinking about applying a stochastic model to see if it influences the bidding decision. And we have to find a method to generate scenarios about reserve prices to do that.
Yeah, but the approach with a stochastic model sounds good. So I would also try to go that way.
Thank you.
More questions? I have not a question, in fact, but I'm curious because it's a very interesting work, and I'm trying to relate with the situation of Brazil, of my country here, where we have a system that depends on the large hydropower plants until nowadays. And we are facing some troubles regarding the availability of water. Some of the questions are related with the point of Christoph. We have to change here how we have been modeling the stochastic behavior of the raining during the years here in Brazil, because it changes in the climate around the world and things like this. And year after year, we are facing some troubles regarding this situation. And it's interesting to know, but for us now, because of our regulation here, your proposal is impossible to implement here, because we do not have a day ahead market here and a reserve market too. We have a still centralized dispatch system on a cost-based system. But I believe maybe in the near future we can use this work or your approach here. Because it's interesting for us. We depend on large hydropower plants here, and we depend on the storage. But now we do not have markets for this kind of thing here in Brazil. Another questions from the audience? We will have more time at the end of the session too. No more questions for Laureen? So we will have more time for Q&A after the fourth presentation. Let's move to the second one. The presentation performed by Marlene, the current state and the perspectives of pumped hydro storage in the electricity system. Marlene, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm just quickly sharing my screen. I think it works, sir. Can you see it well?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, yes.
Thanks a lot. Okay, thanks for the nice introduction. I'm going to talk a bit more broader about the topic of the current state and the perspective of the pumped hydro storage in the electricity system. I'm also a PhD student. I'm at the Technical University of Vienna in the Energy Economics group. And the work I'm presenting is together with Amela, Ajanovic and Reinhard Haas. So quickly an overview about what I'm going to talk. First, I'm going to give a short introduction about the topic and the scene setting and an overview. Then I'm going to talk about the capacities of pumped hydro storages with the focus of Europe and the developments in the future, what is being planned in this front. Then some economic discussions on some points that we picked out on the topic of pumped hydro storages, and then some future cost developments with the technological learning approach we applied then. So yeah, I think on the graph on the left, we can see pretty well the development of the electricity generation in the European Union from intermittent sources with mainly wind and photovoltaics. We can see here that in 1990, it was only 20 terawatt hours of electricity generated by those variable sources. And however, in the year 2019, it's already quite different picture. We have more than 430 terawatt hours in the electricity system. And this trend is going to be rising for sure, because we have very stringent emission targets in the European Union, and also on national levels, countries in is quite quite some targets worldwide, not only in Europe. And for example, in Austria, it's also the goal to have in 2030 to have 100% of renewable electricity in the electricity system on the balanced side. So this is quite, will lead to lots of storage needs in the future due to this integration of these large shares. And there the storage will play a crucial role in the long run. There's also in the scientific community a lot of discussion going on from which percentage of integration of renewable share storage will be very crucial, because we also have some other flexibility options, of course, like grid expansion or demand side management, or there's other things that can also help a lot, but more or less it's 80% renewable share, then storage will be essential. To see what is installed at the moment, I want to show you this graph here. And here we picked installed capacity of the biggest pumped hydro storage countries in Europe. So it's the biggest one is Italy, France, Germany, Spain, and Austria that have the highest installed capacities. And as I think we are all aware that pumped hydro storage is still the main storage solution, and also the only a very mature one. The other storage like batteries or hydrogen storage are were only coming into place recently, which also reflects in the share of electricity storage in the EU in 2019, where pumped hydro storage has a share of 97%. So we can very clearly say it's the main storage solution to date. And the total installed capacity in the EU 27 is 42 gigawatts currently, and when we also include the UK and Switzerland and Norway, we are around 53 gigawatts at the moment. What is also very worth mentioning with pumped hydro storage is that the efficiency is more than 80%, depending also on the type of power plant, and it has very fast response time. So once it's installed, where I will talk about later that there's got some difficulties with that, but then it's there, it has very fast response times, and it's very easy to operate. What is also very important to talk here, I think this audience, everyone is really into pumped hydro storage, so I think this is not quite necessary. But what we really have to differentiate here, that we have these two components that are essential, so that the storage operator has two decisions to make, and he strategically has to decide if he's storing in, which is usually done when the electricity price is quite low. So then the electrical energy is converted into mechanical energy by pumping up the water in the upper reservoir. Then it's stored there, and the height difference makes up for the storage. And then there's this, then there's another decision that can be taken, usually when the electricity price is quite high, to store out, where the potential energy is converted into kinetic energy with a turbine, and then it's transferred back into electrical energy with a generator. So that's the main definition of the pumped hydro storage, that what we are investigating here, and what I will be talking about. And yeah, here in the picture we actually see one in Austria, one big pumped hydro storage plant. But I also already said before that we looked into the capacities that were originally planned and that were then actually developed. For that, we did a substantial literature review and found that the paper of Dean et al. In 2010 gives the most comprehensive view about pumped hydro storage plants, or pumped hydro storage in general. And they did in 2010 some estimates for the year 2009 till 2018. And here we can see that on the left side here of the graph, the estimation, here in yellow, the number of plants that were estimated, and in green, the megawatt. And we can see that around 7,500 megawatts were estimated to be built in this time period, and yeah, 15 plants. And comparing that with the actual development, then we see that it was a bit lower than that. It was around 6,700 megawatt that were then actually installed in Europe. And those plants are mainly installed in Austria and in Portugal. What we found, but the plant number was a bit higher because apparently there was some smaller projects than actually developed than first predicted. And what we also tried to put in this perspective is to show, okay, what is being estimated right now. So for the time period 2019 to 2028, and that the estimate is coming to about 9,100 megawatts and 16 projects that are currently stated as planned or under construction at the moment. So we can say that it probably will be a bit lower than what is actually planned, but around this number. And also from some data from IRENA, what the installed capacity from 2010 to 2019 rose by around 3.75%. So it's not quite such a substantial increase of capacity, but there has been some capacity increase. Now, what I mentioned, I want to discuss some economic points that are special about pumped hydro storage. And what we regarded here, we looked into the situation in the view of the storage operator who wants to maximize the profit. And what we regarded here was the arbitrage profit that he can generate. So basically, he wants to maximize the revenue minus the costs. And this is largely depending on the number of full load hours the power plant is operating for each year. So what we also did, we used this formula that is displayed here, which I already said. It's just the revenues minus the costs of the operator. And what we wanted to show is what is also applied in some European countries. We introduced a grid fee at 1.5% that is charged for using the grid, for either selling electricity or also if you buy it. So the storage operator has to pay that. And it's currently in 8 countries in Europe. This is currently applied according to a new EU survey. But this also is open for a lot of discussion and is being discussed to have some changes here on this grid tariff principles. And what we then derived, we used here, what is also very important is that we used data for Austria for the year 2020 from the wholesale electricity prices exchange. And then we showed here the average costs here in brown and in black. And we looked at it at 2,000 full load hours per year and looked at it what the profit will be. And in that, the overall profit will be this rectangle here. And then what we showed later on is that if you include this grid fee, this profit is substantially decreased. So it will be then this blue line and the red line crossing. So the profit will only be the green rectangle, so quite considerably decreased. So this is our takeaway, is that this grid fee decreases the profit substantially, and this has to be discussed how it should be handled in the electricity system. Some other problems with pumped hydro storage is that each additional installed capacity naturally reduces the full load hours that one power plant can run on these profitable terms. So this is the thing, unless of course if the renewable capacities are also installed in the same amount, so then it's not changing anything. But if it's only adding up to additional storage, it's not limited to pumped hydro storage, of course, but still more storage in the electricity system it becomes less profitable, and it leads also that the arbitrage profits are reduced, because then it's not coming to such high peaks, and the peak load is reduced, and also then in the price difference. This also only applies if the curve is convex. If there's different markets design system where we can have very high negative prices, it can even increase the price level. But this is for the system that we have per se. And it was also very special about pumped hydro storage is that the sites that are available or that are very that have a high potential are usually already taken. So this leads when the topography is not that perfect, it becomes a higher construction cost. Sometimes it's also in some national reserves, or as we see here in Austria, it takes a very long time to get the permission to build a pumped hydro storage plant. So it's often also just much cheaper to refurbish an existing plant and add some capacity there than building a new one. So this is also a constraint in to the pumped hydro storage topic. And what is also being discussed on this front is, especially in Germany, that this idea has been taken up to use old mines as the water reservoir because they're already there. And it sounded quite, it has not such an environmental impact, but it's associated with high costs to refurbish this mine. So there was some time ago, there was this project that should have been taking off in some mine in a mine in Germany, but now I think it's not being built now due to the high costs. So this was the problems, and my last topic I want to show you what we were modeling was the development of the investment costs of different storage technologies. So I want to show you here specifically pumped hydro storage, but in relation to other storage technologies that are on the market and are in competition to that. For the technological learning concept, it's basically to have some learning rates that were calculated or predicted, and then we can calculate the costs at different times, different dates. And as we can see in the formula here, the new cost of according to different learning rate is calculated by the investment cost at a specific date in time. Here we have to mention that we already modeled it for 2020 since we didn't have all the dates here. So we have like usually some numbers, some investment costs from 2018 or 2017 that we used here already. And then we took those investment costs. And then this is the X is the cumulative amount manufactured at time T. So at the time that we look at the price. And here at time 0 is at the time where we took the investment costs from, and B is then the learning rate. So based on that, we could calculate different investment costs. And here on the graph on the left side, we assumed learning rates. It's also in accordance with the International Energy Agency assumptions. We assumed learning rates for the technologies with 20%. That means there is to be expected a price reduction of 20% each time the cumulative amount manufactured power plants or goods is doubled. So that is to be expected. So except from pumped hydro storage, we all assume this 20% learning rate. Pumped hydro storage is also in accordance with the literature, that there is no learning rates expected, as it's already a fairly mature technology. And as we also can see then in our calculations, is that it's more expected, the cost is more expected to rise, as for the reasons I've already mentioned before, of lack of sites that are available, and it's becoming more costly, and also the acceptance that it takes longer to build. And here we can see it's for different sizes of pumped hydro storages, so that for the other technologies expected that the price is decreasing until the year 2050, and for pumped hydro storage, the investment cost is expected to rise. This is of course only the investment costs. If we take the cost per for producing one 1 kilowatt of electricity or storing, it looks different. But here we only looked on the investment cost development. So this conclusions from our analysis is that we'll find that pumped hydro storage is still the main storage technology in Europe, and this will also be the case due to different factors, the maturity, efficiency, and the fast response times. However, will be less additional capacities. They will be lower than expected. No further learning effects are expected on pumped hydro storage. And also the issue of grid fee is quite important, especially in sight of lower possible arbitrage profits in this case. So here is my references, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Marlene, for the interesting presentation. I have a question before Omer. I'm seeing Omer with the hands up. I have a question to start. We talked about the presentation, talked about some permission costs. Are they related to environmental things or not?
Yeah, different. I mean, we have in this, it's I don't know, it's environment protection examination. I hope it's right translation now. That every project has to undergo, especially in Austria. So you have to propose this to the government, and then there's a special agency that is looking into that. And yeah, this is taking a lot of time. So if we have a consortium now that wants to build a power plant, they have to calculate in a lot of time and efforts, that they have to provide a lot of information and yeah, a lot of manpower to provide for this project, and then it's uncertain if it will be approved. So this is has to be what makes it quite costly than to build in the end. And
okay,
yeah.
I believe it's similar to our case here in Brazil, because there is some changes in our environmental laws here. It is hard for us to build again another large hydropower facility like Itaipu, our partnership with Paraguay, and the last one, Belo Monte. It maybe it will be impossible to build a large hydro with a large reservoir again, because you have to make some interventions, big interventions in some rivers. And for example, in the middle of Amazon rainforest, it will be impossible for us to comply. And,
yeah, that's tremendous.
Because of this, you have been seeing here only small hydropower plants that uses only the course of the rivers, no reservoirs.
Yeah, but even that is becoming quite difficult. I mean, here we had some very small one that should have been built in a river where it didn't have much influence actually, and then there was also a quite wide protest also in the population, that people were going to the streets against that. So it was really a political crisis more or less to build that. So I think maybe that's why it's also being discussed if you really just want to have a pumped storage, to build it not really on river sides or like close to water, but use the groundwater resources and just make an artificial reservoir where you use these two height differences, and there you use it just for electricity generation, where it might be in some areas where it's not well protected or not having that big influence on the environment.
Okay, I think Omer,
yep.
You was with the hands.
Can you go back to slide 7?
Sure.
Just so that I understood one thing correctly.
Is it? Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so this 1.5 cents is this basically a tax that every participant needs to pay on either side of the market, like either?
Exactly. If you buy and you sell, you pay a price. So that's why it's here actually, and here.
So the one thing that makes pump hydro a little bit different, a little bit more prone to this type of transaction cost is it participates in both parts of the market. So this is kind of a like 15 euros tax per megawatt hour. So
that's an enormous sum for an hydropower operator to have this double taxation. That's why it's also not in all countries like that, and that's why it's heavily discussed in the European Union how to go about it, because it's quite offsetting the market. And
I see. And if this is this graph is just for Austria, or?
Yes, that's I try to really focus on that, because we have to do it for more countries to see, because our electricity prices are quite different than, for example, in Germany, they're way higher. So it's really just the Austrian market.
So what I understand from this graph is if you have a pump hydro with a capacity of 3,500 megawatts, then that kind of flats out all the arbitrage opportunity that is in the market. So does that mean that this market cannot, like, even if it's free, even if there's no installment cost, you can't really have more than 3,500 megawatt capacity of pump hydro in this system, because there's no need. Is that?
No, it's not on the capacity side. What we try to show here is the hours of operation per year. So it's the full load hours here. So they operate, it's not saying anything about capacity and not of the overall market. It's just to say, okay, with these current prices, at this year in Austria, it makes sense for also with what is already existing to operate it here. We looked at 2,000 hours per year. So then they have this profit. So it's
the prices here are exogenous then. In the pump hydro, the potential pump hydro does not really affect prices here in this graph.
No, in this case, no. It's more also to highlight this problem of this operation times, because then in the further analysis it also plays in, of course, then into the investment costs. If I can operate this power plant with reduced hours, it becomes more expensive to build it, and like this overall cost increases. So
and if you do this for a large scale pump hydro, let's say 1,000 megawatt capacity, this profit is going to shrink very fast for sure. It's like this green rectangle is going to shrink pretty fast, because like the pump hydro is going to affect the prices. When it's buying, price is going to increase. When it's selling, price is going to go down, and the arbitrage opportunity is going to go away.
That's the thing. But if you have enough fluctuating other sources and we need more storage, then it's offsetting it in some way. So this is also something to discuss.
More questions? Toru?
Yeah, may I ask a question? Thank you very much for your presentation. It's interesting to know that in Austria and Portugal, that the installed capacity is increasing. Is it motivated by profit? What is the reason behind the new investment in the pumped hydro storage in these two countries?
Thanks a lot for your question. In general, it's quite motivated is to have our electricity system balanced. That's what we are doing a lot in Austria with it, because we have a lot of wind power produced in one side of the country, and then we use this storage side in the Alps to really have these fluctuations. And also on political side, pumped hydro storage has already a long history. So it's quite pushed also on the political side in one part, if it can be, can be really built. So usually I would say it's many projects that were already planned long time ago that are now being built. I think it's not only just to have high profits.
Okay. What about the ownership of those capacity in these two countries? Are they publicly owned or
they used to be publicly owned? Now we have the liberalization of the electricity market, so the government holds a certain share in them. So it was also being split up on our main provider is called Verbund, so they are having most of these big power plants, but also some others. So yeah, I would say it's a mix between some part is political and still quite a big saying in that, and the other is private driven. So it's
okay. Then are there any government support for those investment, like subsidies or?
Specifically for hydropower, not. I mean, we have this. They are now from this grid fee that I mentioned. So this new law will exempt them from having not to pay this in Austria. So there is kind of a subsidy then for those. But you don't. I mean, what they're doing now is to have, for example, for hydrogen, you'll get a subsidy or something. But for pumped hydro storage, there's no such specifically designated to building it.
Okay, so one last question: What about the existing pumped hydro storage profitability? Do they make enough money, earn enough money to cover the operating and maintenance cost?
Definitely, yeah. That's
okay.
Because the biggest cost is really upfront with the pumped hydro storage.
Yes.
I mean, once it's in operation, of course, there's maintenance, but it's also lower than with other storage solutions. So it's really the biggest investment is really to get it built and having all these approvals, all these big investments to having this environmental impact. So once you have it there built, it's definitely profitable.
Is it mostly arbitrage profit? I mean, the off-peak and
I mean, I think I forgot to mention. Yeah, there's what we looked into specifically is the arbitrage profit because it gives the best perspective of it. But it's also for a capacity reserve market, and you can you can earn also a lot of money there. So it's different parts there. Taking part there. So
okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have some space for maybe one more question for Marlene before we move.
Otherwise, I'm also here after all the other presentations. So.
Let me see the audience here. No more questions for now. Let's move to our next presenter here, Omer, economics of grid scale energy storage. Omer, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for having me. I will talk about, this is a very generic title, but I will mostly focus on technologies like battery that engage in arbitrage in short run, the price fluctuations in the energy market. So I'm not gonna talk about ancillary services, frequency response markets, but at the end of the presentation, if I have time, I will kind of give my general view about those. So I think I don't really have to motivate the role of energy storage in decarbonization. I mean, it might not be seen as one of the key components for not at the moment in the public's eyes, but in the future when we have tons of renewables and waste of tons of renewable production, and the taxpayers are gonna probably get on with this, and energy storage is probably going to be more important than most of other discussions that we have in the energy sphere. So today I will give you an algorithm to find a potential energy storage's impact on the wholesale electricity market. And then I will talk about results in Southern Australian electricity market, which is an interesting market that has a very high price fluctuations, which makes a great market for this kind of a arbitrage opportunity seeking energy storage applications. So if there's a variance in prices, a grid scale energy storage, grid scale battery can make money. How? It's basically buys electricity from the grid when the prices are low and sells when the prices are high. And if there's a variance, then it creates revenue. But while doing that, there's also other things that are going to change in the market if energy storage is large. First of all, there's a pecuniary externality. What I mean by that is the price is going to change, and therefore there's going to be a transfer between consumer and producer. It's mostly going to go from producer to the consumer. So it's kind of like most of the investments in the electricity markets are consumer friendly because you're going to have more capacity, but especially energy storage, since it's trying to flat out prices, it's going to help even more. There's potential change in market power of incumbent firms. This is similar to any other investment in the energy market. But there's also going to be real changes in the efficiency of production. So what I mean by that is when energy storage buys, there's going to be units, mostly marginal units, who's producing when the price is low. And when it sells, there's going to be marginal units that is producing when the price is high. So energy storage basically shifts production of these two technologies in time. And since the cost of electricity production is more likely to be low when the prices are low and more likely to be high when the prices are high, energy storage is going to decrease the cost of electricity production overall into the system. It can also change the CO2 emissions depending on the marginal units that energy storage interchange in time and their emission efficiencies. And if we have a ton of renewables in the market, energy storage can also decrease curtailment by basically buying this abundant production from renewables. And as I said, these changes are particularly significant when energy storage is large, when it's grid scale. So the question that I ask is, are incentives for investing and operating energy storage in a wholesale electricity market socially efficient or not? So the related questions with that is whether having an energy storage in a power system is welfare improving or not. So far, we've seen lots of costs that comes with the installment of different technologies. Batteries are not different. They're actually much more expensive than most of the conventional power plants and conventional storage systems. Our prices are right incentives to create socially efficient operation from energy storage. That's also another question. The CO2 emission impact of energy storage is also debatable because energy storage actually wastes a little bit of energy when it's buying and selling. So that increases the overall energy production in the system. So CO2 emissions might be affected differently. And the interaction of renewables and energy storage is key because in the future, we want energy storage to support more renewables, to allow us to have more renewables and greener grids. And one last thing that is also probably very policy relevant, since these technologies are pretty expensive, who should own an energy storage? Like if we are subsidizing it, who should we give the subsidies to? That's an important question. So in this paper, what I do is I build a dynamic equilibrium framework to quantify a hypothetical energy storage's impact in the wholesale electricity market. I allow storage's uncertainty about prices and other firms' bids. So this is going to be a market where generators are bidding and the market is cleared where the demand equals the supply. I allow incumbent firms like gas generators, coal, power plants to respond to energy storage's entry. The reason why they are responding is because the prices are changing. And then I endogenize energy storage's price impact by finding the equilibrium. So there are two main technical challenges to solve this question of what's the impact. One is the storage's problem is inherently dynamic. So what I mean by that is how much you can sell or how much you can buy depends on how much you have in your storage and how much energy you store in your facility. So that makes the storage problem different than the conventional power plants that decides whether they're going to burn fuel or not, depending on the prices. The other problem or the challenge is the equilibrium concept in these markets, which is supply function equilibrium, which is usually tough to crack, and it's usually not unique. So the way that I try to circumvent that is I try to use observed variation in demand volatility to calculate supply function equilibrium. What I mean by that is basically I use the change in the residual demand that is caused by either change in demand or change in renewables to imitate energy storage's impact. I will have clear pictures to show you what my identification strategy here is. Then I simulate a grid scale energy storage impact in Southern Australia. So this is an example of an actual energy storage that is operating in Southern Australia. This Hornsdale Power Reserve that was the biggest energy storage in 2018. I think it was also biggest in 2019. It's in 120 megawatt hour and 100 megawatt capacity energy storage. So here we have 2 different days. This is an actual production data. The blue line shows the energy storage production. When it's above 0, that means that energy storage is selling. When it's below 0, that means energy storage is buying. And the red line is electricity prices. So you can see that on the left-hand side, we have a stable price state where energy storage basically do a little bit, like few operations, which is mostly, so this is a data where you have energy market and ancillary services frequency markets all together, so that these little cracks and bumps could be production in the ancillary services. But on the right-hand side, the volatile price state shows you a clear path that energy storage actually follows the electricity prices pretty closely. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to model energy storage strategies by following this, basically maximizing the revenue in a sort of a dynamic sense. So to give you a picture about how the energy storage operates, we economists, we love these small graphs that gives us a kind of a clear ideas about how the market works. So this is, let's say this is the PCQ here, aggregated cost curve of the market. So this is aggregated cost curve of all the production technologies that we have in the market, gas power plants, coal power plants. The VRE is the renewables, so that since the prices, production prices, the cost is usually 0 with these technologies, it's 0 here. PMQ, on the other hand, is the bidding strategy, aggregated bids of the technologies that we have in the market. The reason why it's higher than cost is because there's a market power in pretty much all the markets. So there are 2 days here in this graph, D1 and D2. Demand is inelastic, so it's lower in day 1, D1, and it's higher in D2. Okay, so we have an energy source that buys Q in the first period and sells Q in the second period. So while buying and when energy storage is buying, it's going to increase the prices. So it's basically shifting demand to the right, to the left, sorry, to the right, yeah, to the right. And then when it's selling, it actually shifts supply to the right, but it has the same impact of shifting demand to the left since the demand is inelastic here. So it's basically going to shift demand to the right, to shift demand here, increase the demand, and decrease the demand here in the second period. But the difference in between prices, the difference between prices, new prices times the Q, is going to give you the profit of energy storage in this Q period model. But on top of that, there's going to be a change in consumer surplus. The reason for that is that in the second period, electricity prices went down more than the first period, because in most of the electricity markets, we have this convex cost curve in general. So because of that, consumers are now paying less in total of these 2 periods. They're paying more in the first period, yes, but they're paying much less in the second period, so they are making a surplus. And the overall change in consumer total welfare, on the other hand, is simply the change in the production cost of the existing power plants. So that is a little bit different than the profit of energy storage. That could be actually pretty different if the market power is higher or lower, because this total welfare exchange depends only on the costs, not on the prices. Okay, so to give you a picture about the algorithm that I use to calculate these new prices, let's say we have a distribution of the net demand, which is basically the demand of electricity minus the renewable production, conditional on some signal xk. So this xk could be temperature, or like the forecast of wind, or like whatever information that you can think of. And that gives you a distribution of net demand throughout the day. So for each hour, we have a distribution of net demand. So when energy storage is introduced to the system, what it does is basically it will buy low and sell high. And while buying low, it's going to increase the prices. And while selling high, it's going to decrease prices. So it's going to smooth prices. And since the prices are highly correlated with demand, it's also going to smooth demand. Okay. So the way that I'm going to try to recover a firm's best response to energy storage is basically looking for a different distribution of net demand that looks like in a case where energy storage introduced in another way. Okay, so if we have a similar distribution, if our data is rich enough, and if we get a similar distribution that we have with the energy storage, I can use firm strategies in this case, in this forecast day, as the best response to energy storage, because simply all the firms are responding is their residual demand, and the residual demand depends on this net demand distribution. So that's the strategy that I use. I use Southern Australia, which is a nice market for these kind of applications. First is mostly the renewables are making up almost 40% of the generation. So that gives me quite a lot of variation in the net demand distribution. So that is one of the key assumptions that I use here. There's a high price volatility. It is not by any surprise. It's mostly because of this highly high wind generation in the region. There are 3 firms that make up almost 95% of the combustion generation. So there are market power concerns as well. And as I said earlier, the largest lithium-ion battery came online here in Southern Australia. And I use a bunch of different data. That Australia is kind of generous in that end. They're sharing publicly their electricity market data with many details in it. So for the results, I have 3 results that I will go through. The first going to be about the energy storage price impact, and then energy storage ownership impact, which is going to be related with the with this policy question about who should be subsidized. And then I will go through the renewables and energy storage interaction. So throughout this exercise, I will model a hypothetical monopoly energy storage with 120 megawatt hour capacity and 120 megawatt hour and 30 megawatt capacity with 85 round-trip efficiency, which is roughly accounting 2 to 10% of net demand in Southern Australia. The reason why I'm focusing on this particular application is that this is the one that has been introduced in Southern Australia. So this is exactly the capacities and the Hornsdale energy storage that is introduced in Southern Australia that uses to do the arbitrage in the electricity market. So the distangle energy storage's impact, I follow different cases. First is the case where there is no price impact. The energy storage is not affecting prices. Then I introduce energy storage price impact, but the firms are not responding. Then in the last one, the firms are responding, energy storage is affecting prices, and there are new equilibrium prices. So in this table, I show you yearly returns for 1 megawatt hour under different modeling assumptions, as I talked earlier, the price uncertainty, price impact, and firms' responses. The one thing to notice here that the cost part is, I'm not modeling it. Cost is basically given. So this is basically the number that was the cost for the Hornsdale energy storage battery in Southern Australia. So you can basically play out with this cost. The revenue is the one that I'm simulating in the market. So if there's no price uncertainty, no price impact, energy storage seems to be making money here. What that means is that arbitrage opportunity is large enough for energy storage to to make revenue. So then energy storage should enter the market here because there's an arbitrage opportunity. However, the picture is not that clear once you introduce the price impacts. So as I said, energy storage makes up 2 to 10% of the net demand here. So when it's producing, it will have quite an impact on prices, especially when prices are high, when the demand is very elastic. The residual demand is very elastic. So in the third column, when we introduce price uncertainty and price impact of energy storage, you can see that energy storage is not making money. So these are conditional on energy storage entering the market. So so this is basically saying that without any subsidies, energy storage is not going to enter this market. But one thing to notice here, the consumer surplus impact of energy storage is higher than its cost. So for consumers, it could be profitable to have an energy storage in the market that is operating. So that will be my next set of results, which is about the ownership of energy storage. So the monopoly energy storage, what I mean by that is energy storage that buys and sells electricity and think about its own price impact as well. So it has an incentive to underproduce because of its price impact. The low-down one, on the other hand, is the energy storage that tries to minimize the cost of electricity acquisition. So you can think this is an energy storage that is owned by a large utility, okay? And perfectly competitive energy storage is basically the same thing with the monopoly energy storage, but doesn't think about its price impact. So you can think this is a many small energy storages that operate at the same time. The one thing that notice here that, as I said, the monopoly energy storage in the early graph, it's not making profit, but the consumer surplus impact is higher. But when you have a low-down energy storage, because the monopoly energy storage wasn't designed to maximize consumer surplus, the low-down one increases consumer surplus by almost 80%. Okay. But on the other hand, so this is mostly there is an underutilization, there's underinvestments in from the perspective of consumers here. So there are two reasons, and the reason is there are two distortions in the electricity prices. The one is as I mentioned, there is a underinvestment incentive for monopoly energy storage. So there's a market power issue for monopoly energy storage, which can be shut down in the competitive energy storage one. So as you can see here, the consumer surplus of energy, the consumer surplus impact of energy storage is increasing. However, it's not going all the way up to low-down one. The reason for that is the market power of incumbent firms. So since the market power, there's a market power for these three big combustion generators that is in the market, the low-down one is actually giving you the highest consumer surplus that is much higher than the competitive one. So lastly, I have an exercise where I basically double the wind production and double the solar production in the region. So the capacity of wind is, as I said, almost 40% of the overall generation. I increased that up to 80%. Solar was about 10%. I increased that to 20%. So you can see that in the baseline case where we introduce an energy storage, wind revenues and solar revenues are decreasing. So there are two reasons for that. One is energy storage is smoothing prices, and while smoothing prices, actually decreasing the average prices. So because of that, the renewables, which are basically producing whenever they're available, which cannot adjust their production, they're going to lose money because of the change in average prices. However, there's also another factor, which is correlation of renewable production and prices. So if your renewable production is highly correlated with prices, you're going to lose even more because energy storage is going to decrease prices when the price is high, and you're going to have less revenue. So in that sense, the wind is more affected by energy storage because it's mostly available when the prices are low. Okay, sorry, that the solar PV is more available when the prices are high. Therefore, it's going to be affected more. So when you double the wind, consumer surplus impact of energy storage goes up almost by 100%, and the wind revenues are actually increasing. The reason for that is mostly because of decreasing curtailment. So when you have more and more renewables in the market, there's going to be more curtailment, and energy storage can prevent that. And by preventing that, it can increase the revenue of wind. But for solar, for instance, increasing from 10% to 20% doesn't cut it. And also the correlation of renewable production prices is still positive for solar PV. Therefore, the solar PV is still losing money. So this is kind of like saying that the renewables and energy storage are interacting differently at different capacities. To summarize, here I introduce a model to quantify a hypothetical energy storage impact, which is the energy storage that take an advantage of short-term price fluctuations, not like a big hydro or pump hydro that thinks about like a week ahead or month ahead. This is mostly day ahead or like 2 days ahead energy storage decisions by endogenous and price impact. I identify several market failures and possible welfare improving policies. These are mostly about consumer welfare, not about total welfare. So there's an underutilization problem as well. So that's kind of about the ownership discussion. And the one thing that I want to note here also, independent energy storage does not seem to support renewables if we don't have enough renewables into the system. Thank you very much. I mean, if we have more time, I can go through a few comments that I have on batteries, if you're okay with time.
Yeah, so you have time, Omer.
Okay. So the one thing that I want to touch upon is the ancillary service, which is a great question for technologies like batteries that is providing a good source of income. And most of the batteries are in US and other countries as well, is used to provide these kind of services because they're fast, they're good, you can put it anywhere on the grid. So that's kind of like making it very plausible. But these markets are quite small and the revenues are going to evaporate pretty quickly. It's actually the case in South Australia. So the battery that I mentioned, the Hornsdale one, made a ton of money in 2018 from the ancillary service market. But there's another energy source that is introduced in 2019, and that revenue cut off by 50% right away. So there's, in the long run, the energy market is the market that is going to provide the main source of income for these technologies. And another point is the average cost for grid scale energy storage doesn't decrease much with the size. So there's no kind of a returns to scale approach here after 1 to 10 megawatt hour capacity, but there's still lumpiness in investment problems similar to the transmission constraints, the transmission investment in power systems, because the returns are decreasing quite radically for energy storage because the arbitrage opportunity decreases very fast. And the one other point, the last point that I want to make is energy storage can provide some other products as well. As a replacement of fossil fuels like spinning reserves that we mentioned in the first presentation today, like capacity markets. Also, like it can provide a synthetic inertia, which is probably going to be important. Like it's in the future when we don't have any spinning generation in the power system. But all of these require a ton of rules, a ton of markets to be restored and built up. So I'm hoping that in the next 5 to 10 years, we will have these markets and then energy source can make different revenue streams out of these different products as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Omer, for your very interesting presentation work. Questions? Laureen?
Yes, I have a question regarding the response of other market participants. I would like to know, how did you consider it? Was it from the input data you mentioned about bids in the market?
Yeah, so I have bids. I know I have the demand on I have the data on demand. I have the data on residual demand of firms. So I know how firms are bidding when they are facing different residual demands. So therefore, I like this is also about the richness of data. So if you don't have any variation in demand, you won't have any data on the case where the demand is low because of the more renewable production. So this approach might not be applicable for the markets where you don't have much variation in residual demand, which kind of means that if you don't have much renewable, then this approach probably won't be can't be applied. But even in that sense, that this can give you a lower bound in terms of the price impact, because like normally when the demand is high, the firms are bidding less aggressively, meaning that they exercise their market power more, and so they're holding up their generation. But when the demand is low, the market generators are tend to bid more aggressively to meet that demand. So even in that case, my method can give you a little bit information about the lower bound of the price impact.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? I have a little one about the South Australian electricity market. If you have the information about if they are planning to implement something like this or not.
So you mean that they're planning to implement, like planning to create different markets for energy storage, or they're planning? So the Hornsdale one actually is so there are a few big energy storages that is already installed in Australia beginning in 2018, and most of them are government supported in the sense that they so the Hornsdale one, for instance, they have a undisclosed agreement with the local government that they have some mandates to participate in ancillary service markets, even though they get paid, but this is like an extra 2 million Australian dollars per year. But they're thinking about like synthetic inertia, for instance, is kind of one of the products that they're thinking about, because Australia is an interesting market where in different regions like New South Wales, you have tons of coal, but in Southern Australia, you actually don't have any coal power plants. So the whole system is basically gas and wind. So they have these pioneer states that they can implement these new ideas, and they're trying to do those well. So the market is working very well. Like there's no capacity markets. The market power has been exercised every now and then. The prices go up all the way to $10,000 per megawatt hour times, and it's allowed, but it doesn't go all the way up there for a consistent period of time. So it fluctuates very well. So that's kind of a nice market to see that economics is working.
Yes, certainly. More questions to Omer? So we can open again after our final presentation for questions for our all presenters of today. Let's move to the last presentation, Christoph, on the role of electricity storage in capacity remuneration mechanisms. Christoph, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. I will also try to share my screen. Okay, I hope you can see it. So welcome everybody to this last presentation of today. We've already touched a little bit upon the topic of appropriate investment signals for electricity storage. And this is somehow also the topic of my talk today. So I want to talk a little bit of about the role of electricity storage in capacity remuneration mechanisms. For this, I would start with a little motivation. So I would talk a little bit about how it works today in different capacity mechanisms, how storage participation is possible there. And then the paper that this talk is based on is somehow split into two parts. So first we have carried out a theoretical discussion and then also a large-scale simulation study. I would like to talk about both of these two aspects a little bit, and then finally short conclusion and some policy implications. So let's start with a little picture of Europe and the United States. And this is just to show you that the electricity market designs differ a lot, both in Europe as well as in the United States. But more and more of these electricity markets have implemented some kind of capacity mechanism. So the goal of all these mechanisms is basically to secure sufficient firm capacity, because it's not quite clear whether an energy-only market is able to incentivize sufficient investments in firm capacity. In theory, technology neutrality is a requirement, both in Europe as well as in the US. So this means that not only conventional generators should be able to participate in these mechanisms, but also, for example, storage units or flexible demand side units. However, in reality, the rules differ a lot for storage participation. For example, in the PJM market area in the US, that should be somewhere here, we are treated like conventional units, which basically means that they are excluded from the capacity mechanisms because we have an energy storage, has an energy limited nature and cannot provide its full capacity over an unlimited period of time like the conventional unit can do it. Then in CAISO, so California market, it's a little different. So storages need to provide full power output for only 4 hours there. And again, in Ireland and UK, if we look into Europe, we apply so-called derating factors, which means that the storages are not remunerated for their full nameplate capacity, but only for a certain fraction of that capacity. So the question what we try to analyze in our paper is how the parameterization, so how these different parameters are chosen, the rules for storage participation, how these affect the future technology mix, and then ultimately also what is the corresponding impact on long-term generation adequacy. So now let's move on to the theoretical discussion. For this, I would start with a very generic capacity auction mechanism, which is a so-called central buyer mechanism with reliability options. Such mechanisms are in use in quite a few countries. For example, in Europe, in Italy and Ireland. And I would now start a little bit with the characteristics of this mechanism first. So the basic setup is that you have a regulator, and this regulator determines the firm capacity requirement. So how much firm capacity should be procured in the capacity auction, and also the other auction parameters. Then the successful participants of this capacity auction are rewarded with the marginal capacity price of the auction. So it's a uniform pricing mechanism. As I already briefly mentioned, it's possible to use so-called capacity derating factors, for example, for storage units, but also if renewables are allowed to participate, or for just some hydropower plants, for example. And one important feature is the combination with call options. That's the so-called reliability options, which means that if you are, as a generator, are successful in the capacity auction, you get paid a certain premium, the capacity payments, but in return, you are confronted with a price cap on the day-ahead market. So that means that you are no longer allowed to earn any peak energy rent, but this peak energy rent, if it occurs, is collected by the regulator. And since you also have to return the peak energy rent in case you are not even generating, this is basically an implicit penalty for not being available during scarcity periods. So this is the basic setup of these mechanisms, and now it's possible to derive a certain bidding strategy. So how should I behave in such a mechanism? And we can start here with the basic idea that in any capacity remuneration mechanism, the objective is to cover the so-called difference costs. which means that the mechanism should cover the costs, but the missing earnings to become profitable. So you basically calculate the net present value if your unit was only operated in the electricity market. And what is missing to become profitable are your difference costs. And this is what you would want to earn in the capacity mechanism. So if we insert a few things here and make some assumptions and simplifications, we can derive an indifference bid price. So the price that a rational actor would bid into the auction. And interestingly, we can see that this price, so let me start another way around. This price is then in turn decisive for which technology comes into the market, because the cheaper the price you can bid into the auction, the higher your chance of being contracted. And so these prices basically only depend on 3 parameters. So K1 and K2 are just constants. So the 3 parameters that we have are the investment expenses, the contribution margins that you can make on the electricity markets, which in turn depend on the strike price limit of the call option. I will come into that later. And finally, the derating factor that we have also already talked about. In the paper, we discuss both the impact of the strike price and of the derating factor. But due to time restrictions, I will focus in this talk on the variation of this strike price level. So let's go on with a little picture, which shows the achievable contribution margins in a stylized example of a future day-ahead market situation. I will take some time to go over this picture because it's basically the key of a paper, the key idea of a paper. So first of all, on the x-axis, we have the time. So we have 2 time slices, first one from T0 to T1, and second T1 to T2. And on the y-axis, we have the prices on the electricity market. So now you can imagine this situation as first a time period with very low prices, which could be a situation where renewables set the price at very low level. And in the second period, the price would be much higher. For example, if it's a peak load period and some expensive gas-fired power plant is setting the price here. And then we also have the CVAR cone, which is the variable cost of a conventional power plant coming into the market. So now we can derive the contribution margins for different cases here. So first of all, if we look at the situation with no strike price, so the prices can go as high as it wants. And in this situation, we can calculate the contribution margin of a power plant. So the power plant would always want to operate if the price is higher than its own variable cost. So basically, it would only operate in the second period here and can then make a contribution margin of this area, so B, C, D, and E. And on the other side, the storage unit would use the low price period to charge, so that's the -A, and would then decharge again in the high price period. So it would be B, D, and F, but it cannot discharge during the whole period. The reason for that is the efficiency losses. So it can only discharge for a fraction of this period. Now, if we now introduce a strike price, but leave the risk of the empty storage with a storage operator, this means that the price limit would now, for example, be at this height. And we can see that the power plant can now only earn a contribution margin of D plus E because the price is kept at this level. And the storage unit, in turn, can again sell its electricity and earn D plus F. It has to pay A for charging the unit. And now the tricky part is that even though the electricity storage is not producing in this little period in the end, it is still being penalized for not being available. So it has to return C. And yeah, we end up with D plus F minus A minus C here. And finally, the third situation would be again with price limit, but now the regulator bears the risk of the storage running empty. So the only thing that changes here is that the storage doesn't have to pay this penalty of C anymore. And if we now use these findings and do again some calculations, we can derive when the contribution margin of the storage unit would be larger than that of a conventional power plant. And if we recall now, this would mean that that the storage unit can also bid into the capacity auction for a lower price and therefore has a higher chance of being contracted. And what we can see now is that this is exactly the case if this condition here, which is shown here, is fulfilled. And basically this means that with this price limit, we can steer whether whether the storage unit would rather get into the capacity auctions or a conventional power plant. And this means that, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive first, that the storage units would benefit from a strike price, so a limit on the electricity price. So since this was a rather theoretic and very stylized example, we also tried to carry out some simulations in order to somehow prove that our theory also applies there. And for this, we have used the agent-based electricity market simulation model PowerAce, which is shown schematically here on the left. Obviously, I don't have the time to go into the details here. So just the very basic principles. It's a model with a very long time horizon, so 2020 until 2050. And the center of the model is the day-ahead market simulation, which is carried out for every day, and investment decisions that are carried out yearly. And now we have different market areas, which is, as is the case in Europe, which are coupled with each other. So for example, this could be Germany, this could be France, and these two markets are coupled. So the bids on the day-ahead market in Germany can also be used in France, for example. The main input of the model are the conventional power plant fleets in the base year, fuel and carbon prices, of course, then hourly time series for electricity demand and renewable feed-in, and finally transfer capacities between the different market areas. And the major output of the model are hourly day-ahead market prices, hourly dispatch of power plant and storage units, and, which is the most important part in this work, investment decisions, both in conventional power plants as well as in storage units. So what have we done with this model? We have now analyzed a few different scenarios. So first of all, as I already said, simulation period 2020 until 2050. In terms of the regional scope, we have selected 10 European countries, which are shown here on the right. The interesting fact is that these countries have very diverse electricity market designs. So some relying on an energy-only market, some with strategic reserve, central buyer, or decentral obligation. So different types of capacity mechanisms. We have assumed the renewable share in electricity demand to reach 80% by 2050. And also some quite high carbon prices, which would increase to 150 euros per ton of CO2 in 2050. And now with this setup, we have analyzed 4 different scenarios. So first of all, we have analyzed as sort of a benchmark reference run, a European energy-only market. So this would mean that, forget about all the colors here, all of the countries are now using an energy-only market. And then we have analyzed 3 different settings with the capacity mechanisms as shown here on the map. And the only thing that we have varied is the level of this strike price. So in the first situation, we would have no strike price at all. Then a rather high strike price set at 1.5 times the variable cost of a new generator. and then a rather low price, which would be set at exactly the variable cost of a conventional power plant. And this means that the power plant could then not earn any money in the electricity markets anymore, but only earn money through the capacity remuneration. Now, I would like to show some exemplary results with a focus on France, since this IAEE was supposed to be in Paris. That's somehow the reason why I chose France here. And we would start with the reference scenario, so the European energy only market. And now in these two figures, we can see how the installed capacities of conventional power plants develop on the left and of grid scale storage units on the right. And as well, two interesting things to see here is that we can observe a fuel switch towards gas-fired power plants. And then from 2040 onwards, also an expansion of utility scale storages. So this is just the reference scenario. And now we would look into the situations with capacity mechanisms and now look at the deltas. So basically, what is shown here is how much more or less capacity as compared to this reference scenario is being installed. And we have now 3 different settings, as I mentioned before, without strike price, with a high strike price, and with a low strike price. And what we can observe is that the lower the level of the strike price gets, so if we have no strike price at all, we can see that the capacity mechanism mainly incentivizes additional conventional power plants, so gas turbines, either combined cycle or open cycle gas turbines. And now if we introduce a strike price, we can see that more storage comes into the system. And if the strike price is put at a lower level, it's again even more storage coming into the system. So with this rather simple parameter of the strike price of the reliability options, we can strongly affect the technology mix. And this technology composition, so if we have more storage in the system, we have certain advantages because of course that supports the renewable integration. But on the other side, it might also be an issue because if these storage units, due to their energy limited nature, are not able to actually operate when we are needed, we might also run into issues with generation adequacy if we have too much storage and too little conventional power plants in the system. And for this aspect, we have also looked at some deterministic indicators which would describe the generation adequacy level. So if you recall, the basic idea of implementing a capacity mechanism in the first place is to secure generation adequacy. So that's the major objective of any capacity mechanism. And we can now see that for the 2 indicators, so we have looked at the hours without market clearing because no sufficient capacity is available, and then at the corresponding volumes of energy that could not be served. And both of these indicators clearly show that with the strike price level decreasing, we get more storage in the system, but also the level of generation adequacy decreases. And this is, of course, a problem because it contradicts the primary objective of the capacity mechanism. And for this reason, it's important that we also consider that the capacity of electricity storages should be adequately derated. And so the storages should not be allowed to bid into the capacity auction with their nameplate capacity, but only with a certain fraction of that. And we've also discussed this parameter in more detail, but you can look it up in the paper because I think I don't have too much time anymore for this. So now I would like to conclude. So the key takeaways of my talk, first of all, we have seen that the design of capacity mechanisms always creates a bias towards one technology or the other. So really creating technology neutral capacity mechanisms is, even though it's desired, it's not really possible or very difficult. Then second major outcome is that if the capacity auctions are linked with call options, so these so-called reliability options. This generally increases the competitiveness of storages against conventional power plants. And we have seen that it's also challenging to determine the capacity credit of non-conventional resources, but this can have a strong impact on generation adequacy. And I would also like to point at the paper which is shown on the right, on which this talk is based on. So if you want any additional details, you can also look it up in the paper. And of course, also get in touch with me at any time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for this very interesting work. Questions? Omer.
Hi. So I have a question about this strike pricing and the just So this is sort of this capacity remuneration system looks like it's not exactly the same, but PPA with a strike price, power purchasing agreement, or like forward contract with the strike price. Do you have any data that's like, I know there are not many energy storage in the market, but do you see any data that can give you a little bit of information about the selection that these technologies are doing in the like forward contract market or PPA market? Like in a sense, like, and many energy storages seem to be bundled with seems to have a PPAs with the strike price. Like on the contrary, like conventional power plants, they do not have PPAs with the strike price.
I think that, yes, of course, there is some kind of connection to PPAs, but I'm not really aware how storages would behave in this market or also in the futures market. So it is quite closely linked. So the idea of these reliability options is that the product that is actually traded is firm capacity, or is this reliability option. And then you have one party which provides the supply or the storage capacity or whatever. And you get an option premium for that. But at the same time, you are obliged to provide your capacity at any time. And if you are not able to do so, then the regulator can draw the call option and can say, okay, now you have to pay the penalty, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, especially for lithium-ion batteries, there are different type of subsidies in many markets that kind of try to improve the number of the capacity of lithium-ion batteries basically in that system. So some of them, they probably are using some sort of kind of market designs that not probably at that side, but like for ancillary services, for instance. Do you see any type of this? Like, I just want to see whether there is any like empirical evidence.
So I would say in Germany, for example, the interesting storages so far are still pumped storage units. And for pumped storage units, I know that we obtain quite a large fraction of their profit from the ancillary service markets. And the other part from day ahead or intraday arbitrage, typically. But I think there is not so much experience on storages in capacity mechanisms yet, because especially in Europe, these mechanisms, most of them have only been introduced a few years ago. And I think that the regulators are mostly also not aware that they can affect the technology mix by such simple regulatory parameters. So for them, it's basically, okay, as long as we allow any technology to participate, we have a technology neutral mechanism, but you don't really have that. But whatever choice you make about the auction parameters, you somehow determine the auction outcome, whether you want it or not.
Yeah, it's apparently not specific to Germany. Like in PJM, for instance, there's a minimum price that you can bid in the capacity market. So that's a direct kind of a technology selection, right?
Yeah.
More questions for Christoph? I have maybe the final one, I don't know. I'm curious about the wording in our conclusions. You show to us the paper maybe is being published in energy policy.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen only the extended abstract. I'm curious about the final wording. The time to act is now. And I'm curious, just curious. If you want to,
Yeah. This time to act is now. I think it, if I remember correctly, it refers to the fact that in Europe, many of the conventional power plants are quite old already. So are dropping out of the market in the next 5 to 10 years, I would say. For example, in Germany, that's nuclear power plants, and now, of course, also the coal phase out. In France, also the nuclear power plants, which make up for some 90% or so of the conventional generation capacity, they are also really old. So that basically means that we need a lot of replacement and investments in the coming years. If the run times of these power plants are not extended. And therefore, it's important to design the mechanisms appropriately now, because if we have a certain technology in the market, we have very long lifetimes and it might stay there for 30 years. And if we have too much, for example, gas-fired power plants in the system that we don't really want, then we still have them, because once we are built, we're going to be there for the next 30 years. This is what I meant by the time to act is now. So I would strongly recommend to design these capacity mechanisms properly right from the very beginning, or at least to think about how you can properly design them.
Thank you so much. More questions for Christoph? The last chance. So I would like to thank you again, all the presenters here, and would like to congratulate again Laureen, Marlene, Omer, and Christoph for the brilliant presentations. And I'd like to congratulate our audience. And let's finish our session for today. Have a nice day or have a nice night, depending on where you are. And take care of yourselves. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.